Hi, everyone. Thanks for making time to join us for this webinar about understanding A-level challenges in the OCR sciences. We're delighted to have Mike Jackson presenting and answering your questions today. Mike joined OCR in January 2024 and is a subject advisor for physics. He completed an MA in education at the University of Birmingham in 2014. And before joining OCR, Mike was a teacher for over 15 years with roles including acting assistant head of science, Physics Network League for a Trust, a STEM learning facilitator, and an SLE for science. Mike is passionate about inclusion in education, environment, and sustainability, which I'm sure you will see shortly. I'll hand over to Mike in a moment, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. There is a Q&A at the bottom of your screens where you can submit questions throughout the session, and we'll leave enough time at the end to address those. So please do make use of that. The chat box is disabled, but if there are any issues with video or audio, you can pop those in the Q&A box as well. And we will also distribute a recording of this webinar after the session has ended. So I will now pass over to Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, Bella. Good evening, everybody. Nice to be here with you this evening. As Bella says, I'm the physics subject advisor. We are covering the range of science A levels, so biology and chemistry. I am not a specialist in those, but I did teach triple science at GCSE through to level with those. So well, I'll do my best with questions if they centre around those. If you do have questions along the way, obviously put those up, but I've got my screen open focused on the PowerPoint, so I may not spot things till we get to the end, but there'll be time at the end. Great. So just a brief outline of what I'm intending to do in the presentation section. So I'm going to look at understanding the assessments as a whole, just to start with. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with those, but just to make sure we're all in the same place with assessment design. That's obviously really important when students know what to expect and in meeting the challenge of those. Then I'll go into the areas of challenge in each of the sciences and some of the resources we've got for tackling those and some suggestions of what you might focus on. And then we'll go through to questions and things at the end, including if you've got anything around Educate or for Cambridge OCR, we'll leave that open to you. So understanding the assessments to start with. First thing I want to highlight, if you haven't seen these, this is our newest resource, and the A-levels have obviously been around for a number of years now. New resources generally don't come around too often. A lot of tweaking and I'm trying to make things better and responding to feedback. But for a whole new resource is relatively rare because obviously things have been around for a while. So we've got what we call assessment stories for each of the A specification qualifications. So these assessment stories, they're a comprehensive guide to how the examinations are designed in effect. So these can be really useful as teachers for making sure that you're aware. Certainly since I've joined Cambridge OCR, there are a few things in the background, despite I felt being reasonably knowledgeable, that there's little things you come across where like, I didn't actually register that. So hopefully that's all captured in these. As with all of our resources, you can find them on Teach Cambridge. These ones are under the assessment section, but it's got its own little sub menu called assessment support. So it is potentially easy to miss. But everything is always on there. If you ever can't find anything you're looking for, if you're not sure if it's there, or generally any questions at all, please do reach out to us either directly or through the support emails that are on our website, because it's absolutely no problem. That's what I'm there for with my fellow subject advisors. We're there to help you. So no question is too small. If you're not sure, if you want to know, if you want to give feedback, please just do that. So if you can't find these afterwards, please do just drop us a message and we'd be very glad to send you the link over and make sure that you can find them. You can see on the images in the right there are things like accessibility principles included. For A-level physics, we have what we call an MACB mark scheme. You can see the top there for the things like M for method and A for accuracy. They're quite important in understanding why you might and might not get some of the marks in a question. So particularly if you're a physicist, it's worth being familiar with that section of the mark scheme. I'll talk a little bit more about mark schemes in a moment because there's a few other points to bring up. The assessment story is also the first place for the A levels, where command words are actually included for some of our other qualifications. They're now in the specification itself. So if you are looking for a source of command words, as I'm sure you teach with your students, this is our version that's on there. I don't think there'll be any surprises in there, but that might just be useful as a guide or capturing some of the image that's on that page. Also, the accessibility principles are in there, something that can be useful to be aware of as well. Second point I wanted to make is that there are tables. They're in the specifications and the assessment story. Just making sure we're aware of the components themselves, particularly if maybe this is the first time teaching through to the exams. So what is in each paper? Obviously, how long is the paper, and the weighting is really important as well. And just make sure that you're familiar with any notes in the specification about exceptions or just expanding on this. So, for example, in physics, there are some points in Module 6 that require understanding of Module 5. So, whilst Module 5 is part of Paper 1, there are a very few things that can still come into Paper 2 because they're linked to the module 6 points. So the key there is just to make sure that you keep familiar with the specification and the guidance that's in the right hand column. I know myself, once you've been teaching a while, you get used to what you're teaching, and you perhaps don't reference the specification quite as often, but it's always worth a glance back just to make sure that that there's something that doesn't catch your eye on another read through there that perhaps you've forgotten or didn't spot the first time. And again, if anything you want clarification on, please do come to us. We understand that sometimes there are things on the specification that it's helped to get some clarity from, particularly where it goes beyond just the recall or knowledge element. And then on to something else that won't be a surprise, I don't think, but assessment objectives again. I'm very aware from my own teaching that at different points in time there are different elements you might focus on, and it might be in some centres that you're looking to really focus on knowledge as a starting point. There are different ways, obviously, of teaching and different strategies. But if you are focused on knowledge, for instance, and that coming mainly under AO1, just remember that that's 31 to 34% of the qualification. So it's only about a third of the qualification. It's not going to get you very far into the grey boundaries in itself if your students are not able to then apply that knowledge and then do the analysis and interpretation part as well. So just worth flagging that and making sure that you're thinking about how can students tackle each of the AOs. Obviously, you can use things like Exam Builder if you're looking to look for questions to target certain skills. That can be a really good way of supporting. And then just a few other things just to pick up in here. I'm going to, in the spirit of learning to use AI, I've generated some icons with AI. I kind of semi-deliberately did that, partly in an attempt to make slides a bit less text heavy, but also in the world we're all in of developing how AI might or might not support us. So I'm being upfront about how I've used it there. But I don't know, perhaps there's even something in that that shows if you're stuck looking for an image or an icon for something you're creating a presentation from, then relatively straightforward to do these days. So the first one is representing the fact that at least 15% of the content that's being assessed will be on practical skills. So obviously practical skills are really important. When you look at the specifications for all three of the sciences, you'll be really familiar with the practical endorsement in 1.2.1. But do remember that those practical skills that are assessed in the exam as well, particularly the analysis side of things. So perhaps when you're doing your practical endorsement, making sure that although you're focused on your students getting the CPAC, that they are also building on what they're learning so that they're prepared for the examination side. If you've got students who are not able to access the CPAC and perhaps they've had an exemption or it's clear they're not passing, it's still really valuable to them to do as much practical as possible. And of course, the CPAC is a minimum requirement that we're looking for. It's just a way of making sure that every centre is doing a minimum level of skills and practicals, but you'll want to do more and ensure that they work with the specification, not as a standalone, so that it enhances knowledge along the way. Lots of resources for the practical endorsement on the website. Second icon, mathematical skills in science. This one obviously varies a little bit more across the sciences. As a physicist, this is obviously a massive part of the physics papers at 40%, and having really well developed math skills and being able to use the data formula and relationship booklet is going to be really key there. Obviously, that how that's worked has changed a little bit over time as we've had changes to GCSE that have continued onwards, and the consultation out for probably the remainder of the lifetime of the current GCSEs on the equation sheets at GCSE. But obviously, those math skills are still really important in chemistry and biology. We'll look in a moment that the statistics side in biology particularly important, and something that we find that teachers often ask for some extra support with. And we have lots of resources and professional development to support with that one. And then the third icon, difficulty. So there's roughly equal proportions of low, medium, and hard questions. It clearly can be difficult to predict how students entirely see them in advance, but that's the aim with the design. And then the A star, the high demand, stretch and challenge questions are about a third of that higher third. So about a ninth of the paper. I think that's quite interesting because there's a couple of things to think about there. If you are going for those higher grades, then about a ninth of the paper is going to be these stretch questions. And when you're analysing the paper and your students are trying to answer them, that they're going to be considerable challenge there, and that is designed to be that way. So that's something to be aware of. If you are going for an A star, then the grade boundaries wouldn't, in theory, need that last, ninth, just under 10% to get there if you got everything else right or a lot of the other parts right, depending on the grade boundaries. However, they're going to be really important for students' longer term learning. So I suppose there's always a balance there to ask, which there's no right or wrong to, about the time spent developing those really high level skills and the time making sure that students get those other questions right, that they really consistently do well with them and are able to demonstrate that in the exam. But obviously, it's not all just about the grades in the exam. It will be for a lot of A-level students about their destinations afterwards, and being able to do that work that's a bit more challenging, or at least have a go at it, could be really important for their destinations as well. And I said I'd come back to mark schemes as the final bit in this kind of overall section of design. Something I've learned a lot about alongside assessment design. I don't actually design assessments, nor do I manage the assessment teams and the teachers and other experts that work on those teams. The people that do that have a slightly different role, where they're not teacher facing, but we do talk to each other frequently, we generate a lot of understanding of that process. So with the mark schemes, I think when I was a teacher, I perhaps saw them as something that was very definitive. So that's the answer and that's the way it goes. And even though I was an examiner and knew there was some flexibility, started to learn more about how to use that, I think my knowledge has gone on another step. And I think it's really important to be aware that mark schemes that you see are the mark schemes that examiners use. So that they are literally what the examiners have in front of them. Their principal first purpose is to make sure that the examiners can effectively mark those exam papers. So what you see is what they're seeing. Now, they obviously go through standardization as well, and I'm sure some of you are examiners, and there's always a team leader to reach out to for them, which will happen for guidance, which as teachers, you don't have that, but you do have us to come to if you do need to ask a question. What I tend to find a lot of the time is that there are things in the front of the mark scheme that I can understand. When you're marking a question, you're looking at that question, or that item as we call them, as mark scheme, and you're very focused on what's there on that mark scheme, and it can be easy to forget that the front guidance, which is fairly lengthy, applies to all of the questions. And there's a couple of parts here that I think are really important. So particularly that second paragraph, that alternative correct answers and unexpected approaches must be given the marks that fairly reflect the relevant knowledge and skills demonstrated. In other words, the mark scheme is not going to cover every possible eventuality in every question. But if there's something that comes up and it isn't on the mark scheme, but quite clearly that is an appropriate answer within the structure of the marks that are on offer and what the parts of the question are looking for, then you mark that fairly. So that is a part of having expert examiners with the appropriate qualification and skills. And as teachers, that's where you have to use your expert judgment and perhaps consider standardization within your centre if you need that to make sure that you're being consistent with the other teachers if you've got more than one class. The examiner's report is also mentioned. There's often a lot of information there, and I appreciate time is a premium and it can be hard to find time to look at all the different documents out there, but the examiner's report will indicate sometimes how students have got on. So perhaps if you're thinking a student's finding this question difficult, there might be something in there about that as a clue to whether your students having the same challenges that the cohort as a whole was finding, and also perhaps some guidance on what was and wasn't acceptable, linking back to that second paragraph and why. So I would really urge making sure you're familiar with the front of the mark scheme, making sure you're using your professional judgment. Remember that that mark scheme is designed based on the standardization of scripts in that year for that group of students. Whilst you wouldn't expect that to be massively different in any given year, things change. Students learn differently when, as time goes on and different things have been seen in the papers and teachers adjust to questions that have come up before. So you just have to keep these things in mind, and definitely do have a look at the examiner's reports. Another tip for AI, if you're struggling for time, whilst, AI, you should always be using carefully and making sure that you're the expert, that it's interpreting correctly. You can start to analyze some documents using AI and therefore, pull information out that you might want a little bit more quickly than perhaps before, certainly to support you after you've read through them already. Okay, so I'm going to move into areas of challenge for each of the three A levels now and link to some resources at the same time, just to make sure that you're aware of them or thought about them. A lot of the information I've got will come back again from the examiner's reports, which are usually written by the principal examiner, so they're very familiar with what's happened in the series, where they've had to discuss these things in standardization and where queries have been brought up by examiners along the way. So they really are from the expert eyes and give a lot of information in there. The PEs will be aware of some of the statistics as well that come back from the question, so they'll have a feel for how well students have got on with the question and whether success in that question might relate to the students' overall marks on the paper. We would tend not to use the language these days of saying high or low ability. I'm not sure whether you still would do in schools, but we would say high or low attaining. So if a student's done well on a question, is that in keeping with students who are high attaining as a whole in the whole paper, for instance? So first of all, just across the three sciences, some things that come up. I don't think there'll generally be too many surprises here, but good to just reflect for a moment as we go through. And it might just be useful in itself just to remember these and think, are you coming across these and what are you already doing about them? So vague descriptive answers, particularly in the level of response. So this is something quite specific in a way to those longer written answers, and our students able to put their knowledge and their understanding really clearly and succinctly. We do have level of response resources across the different qualifications with examples of responses, how you can respond. A really common question would be, are you allowed to use bullet points? Yes, you are. That's a really common one. So students need to be able to communicate clearly, but we're not looking for a specific style of English. It doesn't have to be in full sentences. It's not an English language test. It's about communicating your science clearly and effectively. And those resources will explain that in a real clear way for you and have some resources you can use with your students if you think that would be useful too. Confusion around scientific terms, probably linked to the third bullet point, and inadequate use of scientific language. So I guess to an extent, there's just the core understanding of terms there, and there are all sorts of things that come in there, like misconceptions. We know is really important. Checking that students have understood terms, particularly if they've come up previously, not making assumptions about what they understand, and there's a whole wealth of resource out there, which you're welcome to reach out separately if you think that would be useful around. Identify misconceptions and ensuring students are familiar with the language that they're using and then able to use that themselves correctly. Going back to the AOs, over reliance on memorized answers. Now, obviously, it's really good for your students to revise really hard to know their facts, but they do have to apply those in the context of a question. And sometimes there can be perhaps a danger of seeing a question before and trying too much to use a previous answer without adjusting that in the context of the question they've got. So if they are doing that hard work and they are relying a lot on past papers, and I know everyone will be using past papers a lot, it's still really important that they understand that they need to read that question on the paper that's there this year or future years and make sure they're not just assuming it's the same answer as before. Contextual application, another one. We do have accessibility principles. So there is a balance here with context where we do try really hard, and this has improved over time. I know it's, historically something that can be difficult to make sure that the context is appropriate and not overcomplicating the question and students can still answer the question. But nevertheless, context is obviously important as well. And being able to relate what students know to the context. I'm sure you're all familiar with examples from the past where perhaps a practical slightly adjusted, or easy example for biology where a different species is used and suddenly that can cause issues. Now that shouldn't be because people are not familiar with what that species is or that experiment is, but it is that skill of being able to take what you know and apply it to a different context. And then finally, on the common ones, we see this a lot too. Language of measurement, including precision, resolution, and accuracy. I think I would be safe to say we see this beyond students. I'm not saying teachers here, but when you look at science in general, in the media and so on, you see these misuse of these terms sometimes. And I think historically you would see them used slightly differently in different contexts. So I would say perhaps at the very strongest end of understanding, there's a difference between the ability to look at some external resources and read around these terms and understand what they're saying in conjunction with looking at the data and the information in the paragraph. But for the purposes of the assessment, it's the language of measurement in science that we use. And those terms have very specific meanings, which are not necessarily all the way that they're used in day-to-day language, or perhaps were used a long time ago now, back about the time when I was starting to teach, I think. So the language of measurement in science is a really useful resource, but we have our own resources based on that that you can use and your students could have just to help them with those terms. Okay, so moving into A-level biology. Appreciate at this point there might be different sections. So there's just one slide for each of the qualifications, and it might be slightly different what you've come here to listen to if you only teach one or two of the A levels. Well done if you're teaching two of them, but if you're doing all three, then brilliant. That's probably pretty rare. So it might still be that there's something within these that you can think about. Is there something across your subjects that you might be able to lend some support on, or just being aware of where the issues come up? Or if you teach, as I did, science at GCSE across the sciences, then just being aware of where there are issues coming up at A level that link back to GCSE. In a lot of cases, I'm sure there are teachers, again, as I did, I felt fairly read up, but still realise, as I'm seeing some of these A-level things, that you can't be quite the same expert, certainly in the short term when you're out of your specialism. And perhaps there's ways within a department or beyond departments across trusts and so on of helping each other to understand where the key points or misconceptions are coming up at GCSE that might help with the A level. So I'd always say that don't forget that there might be something that can be done prior to A level to start to help as well with these. Obviously, if you're in a college or a setting where you don't have GCSEs, that's more difficult, but perhaps you have some links or some outreach or something where you can speak to the teachers around and flag if you're finding that there is something coming through that feels like it could be helpful to address sooner. So first one we came back, and again, these are from looking at examiner reports and going through the subject advisors for Andrew for biology and Andy Brunning for chemistry have inputted here as well. So genetics and variation comes up. Action of plant and animal hormones. Now, obviously, there are hormones to an extent on GCSE, and again, depends whether you've done separate science or not. So there is some variation in there. As a non-human or animal biologist, I've got some ecology in my background. I think hormones are really interesting to me because it takes on this whole other level of understanding, but quite complex for students. And I think if you go to GCSE for biology and think of the menstrual cycle and the added understanding for higher tier, that is quite a challenge really to start to relate how hormones interact. And of course, that's just a simplified part of that as well. Biodiversity, and particularly sampling, Simpson's index. We've got conservation and preservation, genetic biodiversity. So some of that is understanding of concepts, but some of that is statistics. We have a whole section of maths for biology. I haven't put the links because there's lots of separate documents, but that's under our teaching section of Teach Cambridge. There is a statistics for biologist resource, and we do run PD regularly at the moment that tackles statistics. We know that that's something that can be a challenge. And statistics in GCSE science, starting to feel a long time ago for me already, but thinking back is not that developed probably. It might depend a little bit if your students are doing other subjects, are they getting anything from maths and geography and so on as well. And obviously statistics is really important once we get to degree level. So something that's good to develop with your students, both for grades and for later learning, whatever courses they're going on to. Interpretation of micrographs is another one. Photomicrographs come across several points of the specification. So if you can practice those with your students, if you can use those with your students, that can be something that's really useful and is flagged in examiner reports. I didn't mention at the top there is a drawing skills handbook that goes alongside the practical skills handbook. So if you're finding drawing skills challenging, have a look at that. Not so much in the other sciences, particularly not physics, but always something you could look at. And in fact, geology, which we're not discussing today, but comes under science as well and has practical endorsement. There's a drawing skills for geology handbook, might be useful even at lower key stages, just to think about developing those skills sooner. I often found it a challenge as a head of department to decide how much time to put into drawing skills. Obviously, things have changed with what's available online and how often we draw things. So perhaps that's something where I haven't got the expertise in biology there to say, but perhaps skills have changed over time and something to think about how much of that is right to do earlier on, or if not, how do you ensure that the skills are there? Moving on to chemistry. So, identifying shapes and the reasons for different molecules, buffer solution calculation. So there's a maths link in that one. Drawing diagrams of experimental apparatus. Again, that perhaps even more so because we use apparatus right the way through our science. Is that something we're doing in Key Stage 3 or even before these days? Is that even a primary school link? How do we properly draw apparatus? I can vividly remember that from science in school and learning how to use a ruler and drawing your equipment and little tips, but perhaps you do lots of that, perhaps not so much as that's something that needs a look at. Recall of reagents and conditions required for different interconversions or identification tests, and writing equations from familiar reactions. So there's quite a range of things for chemistry there. There's some knowledge, there's some drawing, there's some maths, and then you've got your equation skills. So it's pretty varied there. And obviously there are difficulty levels within, I think, each of those really. We do have teaching and delivery guides that cover a lot of these, including, I didn't put everything that was relevant, but I've linked to identifying unknowns there and pH and buffers. And of course, again, there's Exam Builder if you're looking for past questions. So always lots of practice. Some elements of the calculations obviously come in at GCSE and more so for triple science again there. So something else to think about in terms of the pathway through science from earlier on. And then don't forget we publish candidate exemplars some years, not necessarily every year, but there are lots of candidate exemplars there that you can use. And another way of getting your students to think about answers might be to have a look at some other students' answers in those exemplars and think about how do you mark them. And there's lots of different ways you can use those, but maybe having a go at marking, just reading about them, discussing whether they're right or wrong, how they could be improved and so on. So slightly different approaches to simply using the past papers then. And finally, for the three sciences, onto my specialism and into physics. Again, there are a few things we could have picked out, but we felt these were particularly valuable ones to highlight today. So applying Newton's third law. Obviously, Newton's third law is in GCSE. So again, that raises the question that is there anything that can be done about understanding back to GCSE or possibly even before then? And I have used the phrase applying there, so it's not that they don't know Newton's third law, but do they understand the concept well enough to apply that within questions? So perhaps there's more to do with understanding in the first place. Perhaps it's a conceptual challenge, or perhaps practice of some more questions again with Exam Builder, just to make sure that they really understand how to apply Newton's third law. Probably similar points with understanding centre of mass. There are some links there at GCSE. There are some ways you can develop that with some, if I say, I think practical is still the right word, but certainly hands-on understanding. But clearly there's perhaps conceptual development that needs to go further sometimes for students there. Completely separate and a big topic in itself, calculating percentage uncertainties and then combining percentage uncertainties, uncertainties as a whole. I've been aware since I came in, as Bella said, that was just over 2 years ago, 2 years last January, that this is something that required really some more guidance. Not that teachers don't understand how to do these, but nevertheless having in black and white what we're looking for, how to approach them. When it comes to uncertainties themselves, there are different approaches depending whether you're taking them from the practical equipment. Are you calculating them? Is it appropriate to use a kind of statistical approach, type 1 or type 2, if you're familiar with those? So I've had the mathematical skills handbook updated. It took till January this year to work through. I've got a lot of feedback, worked with people who've assessed in there. So that is very thoroughly updated and in a lot more detail. So if you haven't seen that subject update come through and you're a physicist, or actually percentage uncertainties to a lesser extent for the other sciences, say to a lesser extent in that physics goes a bit further with them, not that they're less important, do feel free to have a look at the physics. It's obviously designed to guide the physics assessment, but nevertheless, there might be things in there that are helpful to have a read through. They are in the practical skills handbook as well, but I've tried to make this slight separation that the practical skills handbook is there to guide uncertainties in practical, and mathematical skills handbook is a bit more about the processing, and a bit more about what you might do in an examination with them, but clearly they overlap with each other. Then we've got explaining production of X-rays, in my mind, fairly standalone perhaps. So there's probably something here that's a bit more specific to each centre in terms of whether or not that is a challenge for your students. I suppose in my mind, I wouldn't have thought the most challenging topic in there, but there are several things going on and there are some quite particular understanding of points in there. So might just be something to think about or do a little assessment. How are your students with that? Does it need any tweaks, or are your students okay with that? Or perhaps you can do a little bit of analysis of results and have a look at the questions they've come up on and have a look how your students did last time around. How were they with that question? I'm always a little bit reserved with that, because when you get down to analysing results on a question by question basis, obviously it does depend not only on understanding the topic, but also other elements of the question that come in there. So is it solely to do with, for instance, X-rays, or is it to do with contextual issues we talked about before? Is there a maths issue and so on? So does need some teacher expertise to interpret it. I wouldn't just take a statistic on a single question just solely in isolation, but used alongside some viewing of the question and your own expertise, then that can be really helpful. And then applying understanding of the young double slit experiment. Interesting one here, because that can overlap with practical endorsement, obviously, or how you do practical in your centre. And it's that applying the understanding side of it. So perhaps not just knowing the technique and being able to record the results, but do they really understand what's happening there in depth? I've had conversation with teachers about starting points. How much do you work through the maths? Do remember with the specification that whilst we try and be clear with our specifications and the points are there with what you do and don't need to know, that the math skills are also laid out separately, and in a challenging question it might be a combination of using math skills The DFR booklet for physics has some things in the front of it that might link in, whether it's using an equation or some of the other mathematical points that are in the front, where you might need to apply that within the question as well. We do separately put in the specification the proofs we need from first principles, but that doesn't preclude using other explanations that are not of first principles and applying that maths in a high level way. So just something to be aware of there. I think again, looking at past questions around that practical, there'd be plenty to look at and test and see where any perhaps further development needs doing or further explanation on that one. Can appreciate that for students there is quite a lot there to process with the maths as well and trying to visualize what's happening. And again, candidate exemplars could be a useful tool as well. So that's the three different subjects. I've just got a couple of other points I want to pull out just to conclude. I appreciate there's a lot of listening tonight, but not too much longer to listen to me. I'm sure you'll be glad to know, but I hope it's useful so far. So progression from GCSE. I've mentioned this a few times as we've gone through. We recognise that can be a challenge. We are very aware from things like the RSC survey, and if you do complete things like the RSC Science Teacher Survey, thank you, because it's so powerful and useful to inform people like us and what we can do to support you further. We redeveloped our GCSE practicals, and I appreciate lots of you might be with another awarding organisation for GCSE. Some of you might be with us, but nevertheless, if you're with us for qualifications, you've got access to Teach Cambridge, and you'll be able to see that in the GCSE Gateway, the A Sciences, that we have redeveloped a lot of our practical activities. We've called this purposeful practicals. There's a guide and then a series of resources. There's a lot there, but there's better technician guidance. But perhaps more usefully for students, we've got integrated worksheets like you can see in the front right there. Some of you might be familiar with those previously. They, in my mind, from having used them in the past, you can't just put them on the desk and expect students to know instantly exactly how to use them. There's a bit of training to do, but it's another way of working beyond just a numbered method. Obviously, when you come to A-level, you might be using numbered methods a lot, so students need to do that, but it's offering different resources for different students and using your judgment and what works. Perhaps more usefully, you'll see in the background there that our procedures have a procedure and an understanding column. And in the understanding column, there's some questioning there for assessing your students. Again, I'm using the term assessment there to mean what you learn from your students in class, not necessarily suggesting you need to have a log or anything like that, but these are the questions you use to really delve down into their understanding. Do they really understand what they're doing and the surrounding science and practical skills there? So probably I would imagine from when I was supporting ECTs, going back a long time to when I started teaching, there's a lot that you have to think about at the same time. I can remember being trained at certain points, why don't you get some questions ready and have them on the desk so you're not trying to sum up those questions whilst you're teaching and managing the room and thinking about the practical and the tidying up. Well, they're there for you, so they might be really useful particularly for less experienced colleagues, non-specialists and so on. So it might be worth looking back at those. If you're not familiar with our GCSE, we don't have required practicals. A bit like A-level, we have suggested approaches and a list of apparatus and techniques that you need to meet through those. So you will find things that will overlap with how you work on your GCSEs with other awarding organisations if you're not with us. So just something to be aware of in that approach there and something that might be useful to you. A final bit of support I've mentioned off and on as we've gone through professional development. This is the structure of our professional development. It's relatively consistent across the qualifications. So if you are looking for something, although they're not always up there at the same time, and they're not necessarily all there from day one in September as we're arranging the people who present them and develop them, this is what you should see across the year. The enhancing your teaching one, the asterisk one at the bottom, subject advisors have some role in suggesting what to include there. So you might see things like aiming for stretch and challenge or higher grades or statistics in biology and so on. There's a bit of flexibility in those. And those paid ones are the longer, more in-depth ones. from my memory of what it costs to do professional development externally in school, it's still a relatively low cost, so perhaps still worth a look. But the other ones there are free. You just need to sign up for those. So something to be aware of if you think that would impact you or colleagues. We are always open to feedback afterwards that is shared through our professional development team, but also you can speak to subject advisors if you ever wanted to bring something up or suggest something. You'll find all of those on our website. There are drop downs to search or Teach Cambridge. There is a training tab. Pretty much now everything is there somewhere in Teach Cambridge under one of the tabs, but appreciate it's not always easy to spot them. And again, please don't hesitate to ask a question. It doesn't matter if you're just like, I don't know where to find this, please do ask us. We don't mind at all. We're there to help you. And just on that front, so a few reminders of where you can get that help from. So subject email updates, hopefully you get. If you don't, you can sign up for them. So you would get, they're the sort of emails where something has happened and it says, be aware that this resource is updated, the spec change has happened. Specs do change and resources do get updated, not in a massive way usually, and an ongoing qualification. Biologists will be aware, had a slightly more significant one. Physicists and chemists will know little things along the way. So it's good to be up to date with those just so that you know they're coming. Um, Make sure you have got the Teach Cambridge access. Your exams officer gives you Teach Cambridge access. So if you haven't got it, all of your teachers should have access to that, and your exams officer can give you access to those. Exams officers can ring our support helpline if they've got any issues or difficulties. They would be glad to help them. I say the support centre because I wouldn't always know all of the ins and outs of the support there, but our customer service centre are brilliant with that. My realm lies in more in the physics and the supporting you with the assessments. So you can email us, you can phone us. We've got a range of blogs. We put blogs up to try and help with topics where we see there's regular queries and we think a bit of depth will help. Sometimes they're topical, like British Science Week, just as an example. I've done a series of blogs on women in physics to try and help raise awareness on that front and give something to use in teaching resources. We run regular networks and subject briefings. Subject briefing usually at the start of the year, though we did one for the curriculum and assessment review this year as well last term. And then teacher networks through the year. For physics, I run them every half term. Um, I would say particularly if you're interested in the physics ones or the A-level subject specific ones, I try to keep them very brief. Sign up for them if you can't make it for this is different from PD, but if you can't make PD, let us know. But if it's the teacher networks with the subject advisor, sign up. If you can't make it, you'll get the video afterwards. If you've only got 5 minutes because you're off to pick your little ones up from school or whatever it may be, drop a message to the teachers there. Here's my email. Can anyone contact me about this? Absolutely fine. I've no problem with that. It's there to help you network with each other. I don't mind how you utilize that. I'm just trying to help there. And I've mentioned the CPD opportunities already. So, we will go into questions. I'll put the thank you up, otherwise I'll forget at the end to say thank you for being here and taking the time to listen. As I remember, can be very difficult after a busy day, running up to the busy time of, well, it's always a busy time, isn't it? But particularly into exams suddenly, for you all and for me, suddenly looking at the calendar and going, it's suddenly coming close now. So thank you and very best wishes for your exams ahead. And please do be in touch, feedback, questions, or anything else. But I'll go back to Bella. I think I can probably, shall I stop sharing the slideshow, Bella, at this point? Does that help?
Whatever you prefer, you can leave them up.
It might help me see my screen a little bit better in case there's anything I've got there.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, we can see you.
Right. So I can see the first question of, do the areas of challenge change much from one year to the next? Are they pretty consistent? I would say a lot of them are actually pretty consistent. You see similar things, raise things like that. I mean, the language of science, the statistics in biology, certain practical skills. Yes, you see them come up. Now, obviously, whether they're assessed absolutely every year varies a bit. Some of them are more common, than others. But yeah, there's a consistency. Obviously, things do improve, and teachers do a great job of responding and trying to tackle things. A good example is maths, particularly in GCSE. I know we're here to discuss A level, but math skills have improved, we think, over the lifetime of these qualifications for GCSE physics. Um, so yeah, it's definitely something that if you see them one year, it's probably something to keep working on. And no doubt they come back because they are more challenging for students. But I'm sure things like language and measurement with continued work, maybe they will decrease in future. Maybe double double slip, maybe that's just something that's conceptually difficult and we'd always see something. I don't know. Um, Question, can you give a link or the exact document name for the visual instruction GCSE practicals? So if you need to go into GCSE Gateway Science, I'm wondering, I might just be able to put a link if you bear with me whilst I'm talking. And you'll see a purposeful practicals under, I think it's under the teaching menu from just off the top of my head. I'm just looking now as we speak. So GCSE, any of the A spec GCSEs, I'm on combined science A. So if you go into teaching on the third column, teaching delivery, and it says purposeful practicals. So I can put the overview document up, but because there's a whole set of resources within that, I can't link to them all separately, but if you just click on that teaching purposeful practicals, and then you'll see there's a load of PDFs under purposeful practicals integrated instructions. If you can't see that, pop another. Ah, you've got it. That's great. Thank you. I was going to say I can share the screen otherwise.
We can also send out a link with the actual webinar for people who
Great.
aren't quick enough
It's
to click through as well.
the one thing with Teach Cambridge, individual documents are really easy to link to. If it's a whole section, we can't link to, for instance, the purposeful practicals whole page because of the way it works. So we just have to guide through the menus there. But any incidentally feedback on Teach Cambridge is always as welcome as anything else. There's lots of ways that could have been laid out. I think we use it all the time, so we know where things are. So you will have a different view on that when you go in it, perhaps more periodically.
We did have a question that was submitted beforehand, which is
Yep,
how can teachers ensure questions are accessible for learners when they're revising?
that's a really great question. Accessibility is another thing I've learned a massive amount on, and particularly, well, generally since I've been here, but particularly the last few months. So there's kind of two aspects to accessibility. There's what we call universal design, first of all, which is trying to make sure that questions are on the paper are accessible to as many learners as possible. So if you think first of all, it's probably good to define accessibility. I'm going to waffle a slight bit here, but sometimes people hear accessibility and again, the technical language and the everyday language. It's not going to mean that every student is going to be able to answer a question. It's not about the easiness of the question. It's whether students are able to understand what the question's asking them to do. In other words, is there anything about the question, looking at the converse way, what isn't accessible? Is there anything in the question that's distracting them or meaning that they're not able to demonstrate what they can do because of the way the question's been written? So we would think about things, and incidentally, the assessment story's got an overview of this. So if you're interested, a good starting point is in the assessment story. Things like familiarity of the paper. So is it laid out in a consistent way? So you'll notice that particularly if you go back to even on these qualifications, the early ones, there've been a lot of change. Fonts being sans serif, that they're a consistent font, that it's displayed the same way. Symbols are similar. The line spacing is, within reason of gauging what you're going to get in responses is consistent. The alignment of diagrams. So for instance, diagrams you're meant to look at are center aligned, the ones you annotate are left aligned. That's kinds of things that can be a good tip to watch out for. Use of names. We're careful. There are a range of names that can be used, but they are from what's the word I'm looking from here? From a set number of them. We're not just going to start picking random names from around the world, which could confuse somebody. Contexts that students can access, we know how important that is. And obviously, context is important, but trying to make sure that we're not being unfair by picking something that some group of students might be familiar with and another might not understand what that was asking, or making sure that at least you're explaining what you're looking for. There's a lot more, and I'm waffling a bit there, but there's a whole range of things that come into design. And in science, we've done a lot of work as well on consistency in science. So are we doing this consistently, not just within each qualification, but we're working more and more on across qualifications, and we're constantly reflecting. On that front, we do post-exam surveys every year. Please do fill those in. They're not something that just get filed away. We look at all of them and we do a really thorough post-series review along with the statistics to constantly try and improve. The other aspect to accessibility can be really important for the practical endorsement as well, which we haven't talked a lot about, but is obviously still assessed, albeit separately from the grade for the exams. And that's about adaptations for learners that require those. Your Senko will be, perhaps more than I appreciated in school, will be your expert on those because they'll be familiar with the JCQ regulations and what you can do. And there are a lot of things that are allowed to be done in terms of a student's normal way of working. But basic principles would be, is it going to affect or be unfair? If you make a change, is it unfair in the way that you've made that change? So, for instance, with the practical endorsement, you can't get another adult to do the practical entirely for someone because clearly that's not assessing what you're meant to assess. But can you make changes to the practical, whether for the whole class or just for that student, so that they are able to demonstrate the skill? For instance, perhaps an adaptation to help someone with a visual difficulty or to help someone handle something, then broadly speaking, without being specific here, yes, you can. So it's about normal ways of working, or we have our special considerations team, and you can always ask us questions if you want more guidance on that. But if you're writing your own assessments, keep those in mind, be aware, because it's quite hard to take everything we've talked about today in design and accessibility and put those into an assessment and be aware of the impacts of that if you do need to do that. If you need guidance, if you need support because you've got a student with a need you haven't had before, reach out and ask us whether for the practical endorsement or the exam, and we can help support you. But the JCQ documents are also a really good resource there as well. Sorry, very long answer there. There could be a day's worth of talking about accessibility.
No, I think that's great. That's exactly where the discussion needs to be. Well, I believe we're wrapping up now, but Mike, thank you so much for putting together this presentation and sharing your insights and your expertise with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us and watched and sent in some questions with your participation. We will also be sending out a recording of this session, so please watch your inbox for that, and we'll try to include as many helpful links as possible. But we also have a small request, which is to help us continue to host and facilitate questions like this one and sessions. We'd love some input from you, so there will be a very short survey in your browser directly after the webinar ends, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a couple seconds to provide your feedback. But thank you again. Thank you, Mike, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their week.
Thank you.
Thanks.